France's 9-year counter-terrorism mission in the Sahel region of Africa is officially over. Emmanuel Macron has already pulled his troops from Mali, where Operation Barkhane first began in 2013. At that time, its mission was to prevent a jihadist takeover. Things have changed, though. In the last few years, there have been 2 coups in Mali. Ahead of pulling out of the country, Macron accused Mali's military regime of cozying up to the Russian mercenary group Wagner.
These mercenaries have been present for years in Libya to take resources and what should go to the Libyan people. And they are leaving. And they have been present for several years in the Central African Republic with terrible exactions against the civilian population.
France is staying in the wider Sahel region, but has its time in Mali shown that it's destined to fail in a mission that some have called a colonial throwback? And does Moscow really have what Macron has called a predatory strategy in Africa? Welcome to the program. I'm Philip Hampshire. French forces were warmly welcomed when they first arrived in Mali some 9 years ago, but relations have since soured. France carried out what was essentially a series of assassinations against terrorist leaders, but the terror attacks have continued and no political solution has been forthcoming. Several coups ruined relations between Paris and Mali and opened the door to Russian-linked mercenaries who are accused of killing hundreds of civilians. So are we just seeing an old-school battle of colonial powers in the Sahel, and will it be the locals that once again get caught in the middle? Has France even achieved anything with its intervention? Joining us to discuss this in the studio, we have Alex Vines, who's the director of the Africa programme at Chatham House. Meanwhile, from London, we have David Otto, who's the director at the Geneva Centre for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Meanwhile, from Nouakchott in Mauritania, we have Jean-Loup Samaan, who's senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute in Singapore. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Alex, if I can start with you. Is this a win or is this a loss, a face-saving loss for France?
It's a loss. It makes France's posture in the Sahel much more complicated. It means that France doesn't have any leverage now, really, in Mali for the time being. So Paris won't have been happy that this is the situation they find themselves in.
Jean-Loup, if I can cross to you. You're actually in West Africa. What's your take? Is this a win or is this a loss for France?
Well, I agree in the sense that it's a loss. Definitely, that's not the outcome that France was expecting when it launched its first operation back in 2013 to intervene in Mali. And it complicates the whole regional architecture of French military policy in the Sahel. So the challenge now is how do you build a regional strategy to counter terrorism without Mali, especially as we see the threat being the threat of terrorist organizations that tend to cross borders between Mali and other countries around.
So in your opinion, how do you use this? How do you build from here your counterterrorism strategy?
Well, there are at the moment discussions both in Paris and between Paris and its partners in the region. What clearly seems to be the desire of President Macron is, one, to change the approach. That's the meaning of terminating the Operation Barkhane, which is more a political message than a military reality. As we already said, that you still have military assets, soldiers on the ground in West Africa. So I don't think this is the meaning of France leaving the region. But the big message that is sent to the partners in the region is that they have to express their own needs. I think President Macron wants to change what has been the problem from the beginning, which was that France was perceived as the one trying to force the decision on the West African countries. And what they want now in Paris is to have Western African countries publicly expressing what they need from France.
David, from your perspective, the other two guests have both said this is a loss for France. I assume that you agree this is a loss for France. How much of a loss for France is it versus a win for Russia, or indeed a win for the insurgent groups within Mali?
depends on what side of the fence you sit on. Some of the countries, for example, the Malians, are seeing this as a win for them. And I think perhaps, it's because, from their perspective, the French intervention had become quite toxic. I think the biggest issue with that, perhaps, was because, I think the French government failed to understand that in counterinsurgency, you could be a hero when you first, intervene as they did, under Operation Seval in 2013. But as long as you do not build the capacity of the local actors or the host nation to then take over at certain point, and if you stay more than the required time, you will then become, you have to servatize, rather than leave at a time when it may be, seen as a glorious exit. So it's a big blow for the French. But I think, it's more of a lose, a loss for the French than a win for the Russians, because of course we do not yet know how much, success, Russia has made, in terms of taking over, whether be it Russia directly or the so-called Wagner group. They haven't made any, reasonable successes, so they can't say they are winning. But perhaps, we must look at this from the lens of the Malians or the countries in the Liptako-Goma region, including Burkina Faso and Niger. What sort of, counterinsurgency backup plan do they have? Bearing in mind that other countries like Great Britain and Germany are also pulling out their forces. So, it's still very early to tell who is winning, but of course I can tell you that France has lost its influence in the region.
Alex, so how does Russia fit into this? Is this a win for them? Is this a loss?
This is a propaganda gain for Moscow, definitely. But in the long term, as David Otto was saying, I have real doubts that this will be a success for Russia. They are overstretched on Ukraine and elsewhere, and they don't have the experience, the resources, or the deep pocket to stay the course. And so what I imagine might happen in the next year or so is that the contradictions of the military junta in Mali will become more and more apparent, and eventually there will be probably another coup, a non-constitutional change, and suddenly the Malians will be asking for broader international support to come in. Because what Malians want is security. That's what they want. The French have struggled on that. Lots of other people have struggled on it. The UN has struggled on it. And the Russians are definitely going to have a really tough time. They already are.
So what could the French have done differently then?
Well, it's what we heard from our colleague in Nouakchott. The problem of France, I think, was it was a bit neo-colonial. It kind of followed a pattern of what's called France-Afrique, telling Africans what they should be doing rather than listening to Africans. And I would agree with him that Paris has probably learned that bitter lesson and is going to be much more driven, led by what the African partners want. But we also do need to be careful that security investments in the Sahel have been building up Praetorian guards around elites. So what I'm really saying is that we've been turning fragile states into brittle ones, in that the one functional entity in those states was the military. And the paradox is those militaries, some of them, have been staging coups. That's not something that we should be welcoming, and we should be learning from that mistake.
Jean-Loup, do you agree with that? I see a lot of nodding there.
Yes, I think unfortunately the perception, the optics of French intervention in Mali became this idea of a neo-colonial project. But I don't think when President Hollande started the intervention that there was any imperialistic objective. I mean, when France intervened in Mali in the first place, there was the belief that this would prevent the collapse of the state in Mali, but it would also contain further terrorist organizations across Africa, but also targeting Europe. That was the initial belief. Eventually, we realized that there was no clear link between terrorist organizations operating in the area and those that would have been attacking France. We didn't see any event in France or Europe that would prove that evidence. But at the moment, I think that President Macron is facing a difficult situation. As it was said, the idea is not to leave West Africa alone, but at the same time to find a new type of relationship. This is nothing new, unfortunately. France has been struggling to redefine its policy towards its former colonies for a long time. So in a sense, what we see is a new version of old problems.
Has it not left, though, a power vacuum in Mali by pulling out when the state is, as we were just hearing from Alex Vines, a little bit brittle, when it's suffered from military coups? Is there not a power vacuum there because France has gone?
Well, I mean, the answer is yes, but France didn't have any choice in that situation. The initial reaction, if you remember the first coup in Mali when it happened, the French government and the French armed forces were very cautious. They tried to disconnect the politics inside Mali from the fight against terrorism. What they tried to do initially was to protect what was the military cooperation and to keep its distance from the coup. Eventually, that disconnect was impossible to sustain. And as we've seen, when you have your ambassador, the French ambassador, being kicked out of the country, it doesn't leave any choice for France but to withdraw its forces. So there is definitely a security vacuum. What we see now is that the security situation in Mali is nowhere near any improvement. But again, France was only accepting the situation rather than changing and forcing it.
David, what do you make of that? If you were advising the French government right now, would you say, hey, you did absolutely the right thing? Or would you say, actually, what we need to do is change strategy, do it this way?
I think I would say to them, there's a good in every bad. I mean, the bad being that, the French, have been forced to pull out of Mali, not on their timetable. But what I would advise is that, perhaps is that, in future, when they do have other opportunities to assist in counterinsurgency operation, there should be a very clear timetable in terms of, how much involvement and what that involvement entails. I mean, in other words, what does success look like, and what do they intend to get out of this operation or support? That should be very clear, and not just clear to the population, but very clear to the leadership in power. I think that was one of the biggest issues. Another area where I think the French were lacking in is clearly working alongside the local forces, the host nation. I think at some point the Malian authorities had complained that there were certain areas in the country where they were not allowed to have access to, and that the French were blocking any local or host nation security forces from getting access to. That's a big no-no, and it has a very fine way of backfiring. And ensuring that the French lose local support. Another issue I think is that as my colleagues have mentioned, there was a big gap between the over focus of the French on the military aspect of the operation, but also leaving behind the leadership issues, the issues of governance, and what that meant was that even when the French were succeeding on the ground in defeating the jihadists, there was no change, or there was no visible change, as far as politics, and good governance, was concerned. So the Malians couldn't, see any difference. What they could see was that, they didn't have a good governance system. They lacked basic necessities. The economy was crumbling. And, they then made it a very clear comparison that it was because, the French were not doing their job. So I think there's a whole lot that the French will learn from this, and perhaps if they're not careful, and if they don't learn from this, they may experience the same situation in Niger Republic, where they've now moved, some of their troops. Because of course, the population will be very keen at some point, to start raising flags as to if you didn't do well in Mali, and you're struggling here, then you should leave the entire Liptako-Goma region.
Well, let's have a look at what's going on in some of that region. We have a graphic here showing that across the Sahel region, south of the Sahara, there are more than 2.5 million people who've been displaced in the last decade. In fact, since the beginning of 2022, conflict in the central Sahel, which is Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, has caused 2,057 civilian deaths. That's more than double the figure compared to 2021. We've now got 9.7 million people who are severely food insecure across the three countries as well. So I've got to bring this back to you and just ask, it's a little bit glib to say, but is this in some ways France's Afghanistan? When you look at the situation the Americans and the British found themselves in another country where they went into for the best of intentions, found it too difficult and had to pull out again.
Well, it's absolutely correct that Africans, not just the Malians, asked for French to go in 2013. And that resolution in the UN Security Council was co-written by Nigeria and France, for example. So the initial intervention had full legitimacy and endorsement, learning on the mistakes, actually, of the intervention in Libya. So France had learned that lesson. Fortunately, things then haven't gone well. And France and the West, so it's not just France. Germany has pulled out from its UN operation, supporting the UN operation next year. Britain announced that last week. Sweden's already pulled out. But you're also finding countries like Egypt have also pulled out. So it's a broad number of troop contributors that are pulling out of Mali. The result, I think, will be reconfiguring the way that security's looked in this region. And the idea, I think, is to contain Mali at the moment. And so we see more engagement in Niger, but I think we'll see more engagement in Burkina Faso, because what I'm sensing is there is a reading that the military junta that's in Burkina is more amenable to multilateral engagement than the one in Mali, which is more or less insulted everybody except the Russians. And so I think there is a waiting game now for those contradictions to play out and to at least protect the rest of the region with a reconfiguration of security out of Niger. But Britain, for example, is reconfiguring its posture tied to the Accra initiative that comes out of Ghana. And Burkina Faso then becomes a frontline state in all of this.
Is this not, in many ways, an unwise position for the Malinese government to find themselves in? Because with the best will in the world, Russia simply doesn't have the funds to go around nation building, supporting other countries. If it had those funds, if it had those military assets, it would probably be using them in Ukraine. Please,
go to Bamako and interview the junta. I couldn't understand that they insulted everyone at the UN General Assembly except the Russians. It's a real misreading of the situation, and they are unable to provide the security that Malians want. I suppose I hope that Malians themselves will wake up to this, and that will open up peace processes inside Mali, including with some of the jihadi groups also, because this is not a way to nation build or move forward in Mali at all for anybody.
David, do you concur with that?
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to make a point, in terms of what Alex Vine is saying. I think, when you go to Mali and, you talk to the local Malians, I think the point that they make very clearly, is that results, do not demonstrate the need, to have a continuity with, the French operations. Of course, you did mention earlier on that, there's a high level of propaganda, and that's correct. But the ordinary Malians, do not feel that, the French presence or the presence of other nations, that are there to fight the counterinsurgency operations, has been any successful. And I think what they're looking for is to see what the alternative that, the current junta will provide. And, I think fairly, one cannot deny them that. I think it's always good to try something new and see if it works, before you can count it out altogether. Now, in terms of the linkages, which you made, Alex, between, the junta in Burkina Faso I can tell you very well that I don't see a difference in terms of approach between the young captain in Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta in Mali. They are very close and they speak with each other. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the young captain did visit the Malian president for a couple of days, and I'm sure that the purpose of that is to try and ring fence these two nations, against any French, intervention, so to speak, or any French support, against the jihadists in the country. So I very much doubt that France will have any sort of leverage, after leaving Mali. I think it's just a matter of time. I see the French presence in Niger Republic as some kind of a transition, whereby they're actually on the way out. But again, it all depends on in a few weeks or months to come. But again, Russia, I don't think Russia will make any difference. I think where we need to make a difference, or the Malians need to make a difference, is if they collaborate between these three nations.
Well, let me bring Jean-Loup in on that. What do you do? I mean, we were just hearing there from David that there needs to be more collaboration between the various different nations in that region. Have they not created a hole in any strategy to do with trying to clean up the Sahel by leaving Mali out? It's like having a jigsaw with a central puzzle piece missing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there are several aspects here. The big question is if what we see right now in Mali is an exception, meaning that Mali will remain the only one that kicked out the French, and that is now also left actually the G5 Sahel, the main regional body that was created to cooperate and to strengthen the armed forces in the region, or if we see that as a broader movement. I think what France is trying to do now is to make sure that the rest of the region doesn't follow the Malian example. So far, I'm still optimistic that we can let's say protect the other partnerships, the other aspects of military cooperation between France and the other members of the so-called G5 Sahel.
Thank you. We've got a clip here from French President Emmanuel Macron himself, if we can play that.
A number of powers who want to spread their influence in Africa are doing this to hurt France, hurt its language, sow doubts, but above all, pursue certain interests. You only have to look at what's going on in the Central African Republic or elsewhere to see that the Russian project is underway there. When France is pushed aside, is a project of predation.
Those are very strong words, aren't they? Predation in Africa. Is he doing that to sort of cover himself politically, or do you think that that's actually a valid criticism of how Russia's acting?
Oh, Russia's definitely a spoiler. And the Central African Republic caught Paris by surprise. It was a Russian experimentation. In fact, the Russians were encouraged to go in originally by the former leader in Sudan, al-Bashir. The Russian strategy in Central African Republic was, how do we irritate France? That was one of the things. And also given...
Very successfully is the answer.
And very successfully. And so what Russia then does is see where it might have opportunity to do the same thing. I mean, this all predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But of course, anything that overstretches the West is in Moscow's interest. And dividing countries and making sure that they realize that Russia still has a global footprint is part of the strategy. We are in a de facto Cold War with the Russian Federation, and one of the theaters is Africa, and centers of that theater at the moment are Central African Republic, Libya, and Mali.
Is Russia not on a hiding to nothing here from a simple cultural basis? There is the CFA franc, this financial linkage between most West African countries and France. There is the linguistic barrier, which always creates a cultural linkage between different places. The education systems for instance. So Mali might be having a tiff this week, but it could reverse very quickly. Is Russia not on a hiding to nothing on that front?
Well, do you remember in the Cold War, for a while, Mali was also sympathetic to the Soviet Union. So, there is some, amongst small parts of Malian society, memory of that. And so, be it through social media, be it by offering a defense partnerships, that can seem attractive. And then the contradictions have to come out. What I'm hoping is that over time, African governments will see that actually Russia hasn't been too successful and that their model isn't one to be replicated.
Alex Vines in the studio, thank you for joining me. David, Otto and Jean-Loup Samaan, thank you for joining me as well, live from Mauritania and also from the United Kingdom. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and from the rest of the team here, thank you for watching and goodbye.